Inferno, Purgatorio. No matter what your interpretation of hell or purgatory are, there is one universal constant between the two, that being torment eternal. In Christianity, hell is often described as fire and brimstone, demons torturing unredeemed souls for all of eternity. But what I'm more intrigued by are interpretations in which a personal hell is crafted from the scraps of your sins and the bones of your transgressions, put together to make a perfectly curated hell just for you. But by that mark, what does hell look like for someone whose sins are monumental? Someone whose sins are so great in number they manifest into the very thing that deals out their penance. Family Comes First is a fan-made film based in the Five Nights at Freddy's universe, and it's by far the most high-quality production to ever come from the FNaF community. It's an hour-long, claustrophobic nightmare filled with the psychological horrors of William Afton's twisted mind as he faces his penance for the atrocities he's committed. All the while, he's been given one final task by a higher power before he's allowed to pass on from the real world and into his eternal suffering. Not to glaze Scope.Wad too much, but one of the things that makes this film so special is that even if it hadn't been part of the FNaF universe, and we didn't have any of the context of the games, books, or the movie, this film would still stand on its own as an incredible piece of horror. If you gave this to someone who's not at all familiar with the lore of Five Nights at Freddy's, I can almost guarantee you that they'd be grasping for more of any information they could get on this enigmatic man in a bunny costume. This film is absolutely genius in both its take on the FNaF story and its methodical use of decades of knowledge on horror as a genre. If you haven't watched it already, I cannot recommend strongly enough that you go and experience this horror film blind. But if you're ready for my analysis on this piece, then I won't keep you waiting any longer. The first sight we're greeted with is what appears to be what's inside William Afton's spring-lock suit. The locks have dug into the bone, and the rotted muscles have wrapped around them like vegetative overgrowth. Afton dreams of one day escaping the room he died in, to be greeted by lush green foliage. But when he does finally escape, all he finds are gray skies, rain, and the husk of what used to be Fredbear's family diner. Afton leaves, angrily storming off up until he finds none other than his daughter. Or at the very least, the animatronic his daughter possesses. He passes out and is dragged somewhere unknown. It's almost as if whatever higher power that's been keeping him in this state of undeath has also been keeping him on a leash, leading him to where he's meant to go and yanking it when he wanders too far off. While he sleeps, he dreams of sitting in a theater, watching a film and speaking to an ominous second character about the night of his first kill. He feels no remorse, no pity, no shame. The only regret he feels is that he didn't get the same enjoyment out of movies anymore. He's despicably cold and unnaturally unfeeling, just like the suit he's trapped inside. Worth noting is that during these shots of him sitting alone in the theater, his suit is much less weathered, and more so resembles how he looked in the third game. What I believe this means is that these scenes take place while Afton is still trapped in the FNaF 1 location, looking back on everything he'd done, sitting against that wall. After he reunites with his daughter and the other possessed animatronics, he hallucinates and perceives Lefty to be Freddy, before passing out once again and waking up in the FNaF 1 location. Two things I'd like to point out here. One of them is the stylistic choice not to dub over these lines of dialogue. I was iffy about this choice on my first watch, but the more I sat with it, the more I liked and even agreed with it. Giving Afton or the other animatronics a voice humanizes them in a way that removes the disconnect between the viewer and the characters. By reducing the dialogue to unspoken lines of text, the viewer is allowed to come up with their own solution as to how these spirits are communicating with one another. It almost seems as if they speak to each other in an ethereal telepathy, or some way in which mortals are incapable of hearing, or that everything they wish to say is simply communicated in their blank expressions. The other thing that I wanted to point out is the genius way that Scope uses lighting to convey tone. This is my favorite shot in the entire film, and despite how mundane it may seem, there is so much passion and experience in how Freddy's emotion is conveyed. His eyes don't change color to be black with white pupils or glowing red. Even his eyelids aren't there to convey what emotion he's feeling. But the simple action of him cocking his head forward enough that his eye sockets cast an eyelid-like shadow onto his eyes to appear as though they are half-lidded makes his expression feel deadpan and yet so filled with contempt. When William looks down, he sees that his suit is just as pristine as it was when it was still in service, as are the animatronics around him. He continues looking around the empty, dark, shiny corridors of Freddy Fazbear's Pizza until Freddy himself moves off stage to appear before him once again. But once he faces him, his face is contorted and rotten like a decomposing corpse. The spring locks seem to go off all over again as the rest of the animatronics' faces contort in a similarly disgusting way. Fabric becomes flesh and metal becomes bone. He's then dragged down an endless sea of tables and tile before his eyes are taken and an ominous fleshy creature looms over him. This springlock scene is unlike any other we've ever seen in any medium related to FNaF. There's no screaming, only the sounds of William's labored, shallow breaths as the springlocks slowly and individually close in on his body, cracking the bone and spilling his blood. The scene is over a minute long. It's uncomfortably close, but we don't actually see any of the gore beneath the suit. We don't need to. We see only William's wide-eyed stare as he endures insurmountable pain. But it's only just the beginning. This is the least of what he's yet to face. The scene continues until William's eyes gloss over and the camera unfocuses as he takes his last mortal breath before keeling over. We're then taken back to the theater. The mysterious other character asks Afton if any of the terribleness he feels from what he did is at all geared towards his actions, if he felt any remorse. Afton confirms what we already knew. He didn't care then, and he doesn't care now. We also get confirmation that these sequences do take place when Afton is still trapped within the FNaF 1 location. After Afton wakes up, he's greeted once again by Elizabeth. He's passed out again. He tells her of the mysterious character he met while in and out of consciousness over the years, who we can summarize to be none other than Old Man Consequences. This conversation plays out as if both characters are still alive. Afton speaks as though he's only reminiscing on an old friend in his pond. The most tragic part of this conversation by far is how Elizabeth talks. She died a child, and it's unclear whether or not she understands that she can't come back from her death. She can't go back to the physical world as she once was. Afton says that Elizabeth's brothers will take her fishing one day, but when she asks if Afton himself will be there, he falls silent. We then see Lefty again, who we knew from the games to be possessed by the same spirit that once possessed the marionette. This spirit is Charlie, the daughter of Afton's former business partner and close friend, Henry. She's a watchful, vengeful guardian who wants nothing more than to see William burn. But the other spirits must be freed first. This is the final task William is given before he's allowed to proceed to his hell, and Charlie seems to be one of those left in charge of making sure he sticks to the plan. We go back to a discussion between William and the old man. He speaks of a machine he made to keep her forever, but it's unclear whether he's talking about Henry's daughter or his own, Elizabeth. The old man checks Afton on the lies he tells himself and delivers a cold line directly insulting him.
What? Do you want me to lie to you?
I haven't heard a good lie in a while.
Well, I think that you were a good father, and that your creations were quite innovative.
You really believe that?
Believe what?
That I was innovative?
Of course, Afton misses the point. Afton wanders down the alleyway and finds a poster for a show on some streaming platform. It seems that the rest of the world knows of Afton's misdeeds and have since decided that glorifying him was the best route to take. Not too dissimilar from our own world, in the way that we immortalize our evils, inadvertently bringing reverence to their image and forcing the families of those lost to have their wounds reopened all over again. We then see yet another unknown character, clad in black leather. He calls Lefty to enter the building, and then we see his emaciated purple face. This is Michael Afton. And upon seeing his father, he flies into a rage, plunging a knife into William's chest. The burning of Fredbear's, now Fazbear's Fright, wasn't enough to put him down. He's come back for a second time, but the third time's the charm, right? We see this statue a number of times throughout the film, a statue of what looks to be a dancer. It makes me think of William's wife, the mother of his children, who went on to possess Ballora. Perhaps this is a way to show that she's still watching over them, waiting for William's victims to be set free. Michael cries out, scorned at the fact that neither of them seem to be capable of dying. He asks William if he still thinks it's his fault, I assume referring to the youngest son's death at Fredbear's. They both exchange woes that it's only been 30 years since... Well, on this I'm not sure. Could this be referring to the last time they saw each other? I wouldn't think so, considering William and Michael saw each other at Fazbear's Fright, and that would mean that this takes place sometime in 2050, which I doubt. Or could they be talking about the first time William died? This to me makes the most sense considering the 30-year gap between William's first death and the events of the third game. Either way, my point for bringing this up is to bring your attention to the amount of time that has passed since the murders took place. To quote Scope themselves, one of the many horrors that weren't given much of a spotlight in the movie is time perception. In theory, it develops as we age, but once we die, it vanishes. William died to a spring lock failure as a grown adult, but his kids and victims met their fate much earlier in their lifetime. This would make them feel like 30 years is much longer than it is to William. It's my belief that, like in FNaF Pizzeria Simulator, Henry is the organizer of this little meetup of souls. He wishes to free them all and finally put an end to their torment, but one still remains. Michael asks William if he knows what the date is, before reminding him of the important day. Elizabeth's birthday. Turning around, William sees Elizabeth, and she embraces him, but points out an odd cloud in the sky. William's hallucinations are worsening, and before he knows it, Elizabeth is gone. Perhaps she was one of the hallucinations. Worth asking, though, is the question of whether or not these are just hallucinations or something more. They seem almost eldritch in nature, too grandiose to be real, but could it be that this is the torment he's subjected to while he's on the surface? William seems to collect himself, but yet again stumbles upon the dancing statue. It looms over him, seeming to look right down into his eyes, staring down into his miserable soul, judging him. Another hallucination sees him vomiting blood, flooding the streets around him, and again we see that oddly shaped cloud watching over him. As he lays in his own sanguine ocean, he sees himself in his pristine yellow bunny suit as it slowly pushes itself to stand. But before it can, he finds himself back at the old man's lake. As he peers into the trees, he spots an ominous figure, donning a silhouette similar to his own. William makes his way to the old man, asking him if the things he sees are really there.
Are the things I'm seeing even real?
Perhaps. In some way.
Keep being cryptic and I'll stay here for another 30 years.
I've seen similar things happen to plenty of sinners. These things could take shape of those around them. They could even harm them. Maybe it's that one spirit you couldn't find.
No, I would have known. Why is it after me?
Dead sinners aren't meant to stay around. You've been on the surface for decades. You may attract entities that aren't meant to be.
I'm not sure. What if it's not real?
Maybe it is. Maybe it isn't. Maybe none of us is. And it's just your dying imagination as you keep rotting inside that room, consumed by your own mind, waiting for one day to get out.
I only see it all fall apart.
You'll make it fall apart. Take your time and think about what you'll do next. They're outside time and space, after all. Do not expect any redemption.
William enters the lake house and wades into a dark tub as he ponders his next move. On a side note, I love the way Scope recreated Peeping Springtrap from the third game. But as he thinks, he notices movement out of the corner of his eye. A shadow. A shadow which becomes the other bunny we saw earlier. A shadow which lunges at him. He awakes once again, pulling at his eye sockets as if to try and keep himself awake. Rummaging through a pile of trash to find something to give Elizabeth, a nearby payphone rings. It's Henry. He hurries William to try to find the last spirit, as time seems to be running out. Just then, William makes a suggestion.
Do you still have those old audio tapes?
I do. Mike's been using them.
Let him use them on me.
You'd lose control of your suit. It'll become quite aggressive.
I don't care.
Very well. William finally finds a gift for Elizabeth, but just as he lets his hand fall out of view, he's greeted with the giant head of the Golden Bear himself. Only this time, he's not made of felt and metal. He's made of flesh and gore. They stare at one another blankly as the phone spits garbled nothings. William moves on and finds Elizabeth once again, to give her the gift he found and wish her a happy birthday. There's something deeply sickening about this scene. William gives his daughter a miniature version of the machine he created for death. The machine that took her life and trapped her soul within it. You can't help but think about how sweet the scene feels, But thinking about it on a deeper level makes it feel almost as if he's just taunted her, rubbed salt in the wound. But perhaps his intentions were good, and to Elizabeth they were. And we are again reminded that she died a child, and that she is still just a child. And for that reason, that line, "It's just for me," is absolutely heartbreaking. William spots himself once again, sporting that pristine gold, but Elizabeth sees it too. William sends Elizabeth off, and thinks back to the figure he saw in the woods, and then to the room he was trapped in for so many years. Another conversation between himself and the old man, where once again he shows no remorse for what he's done. But the fact we're brought back to this again and again makes me think that maybe William is thinking back on these conversations because he's starting to doubt his resolve. He is starting to show the cracks of remorse for everything he's caused. Michael plays the audio tapes used to activate the animatronics for William, and in that moment he's brought face to face with the other bunny and the giant head of Fredbear. This bunny's name is Belphegor, and I'll be addressing her as such from now on. William reaches his hand out to Fredbear as if to coax him into coming out. A gentle gesture, but one that leads him nowhere. He finds himself back at the lake.
It came here looking for you. Definitely not a human spirit. Not this one. We should get it out of my lake. Before I lose my temper as well.
Belphegor pulls William down into a seemingly endless pit until he lands on a thin beam above a giant gory face, peering up at him from below. We cut between his fight with Belphegor and his struggle in the real world, seemingly unable to keep himself under control in the maze of vents. He's pulled down even further into a corridor with a familiar face at the end. Belphegor gets him to the ground, but William turns her attempt at a killing blow into a lethal blunder. They're only faced with each other again in a familiar-looking elevator. After a brief moment of calm, Belphegor strikes William again, and it seems as though she has the upper hand. She slams his head against the ground, again flashing William into the real world for just a moment, but they're interrupted by a giant claw, pulling them into their next arena. Fredbear watches on, and we get one more flash from the real world, showing that William has hurt Elizabeth in some way. When he awakens in the spirit world once again, he finds himself in the scooping room of the sister location, held in place by Belphegor as the scooper readies to tear into him. But with a final, decisive strike, Belphegor is defeated once and for all. The scooper dislodges her jaw and sends her to the ground. Ironically enough, each of the 3 times she's taken a hit during this fight, she was attacked the same way as each of William's children when they died, seemingly in chronological order as well. The irony goes even further when you consider that William's creations were what killed his children. Balfabon begins to regurgitate a heart before quickly trying to swallow it down. Afton doesn't let her. He grabs hold of the heart and Balfabon collapses for the final time. But when William looks down, there are 4 hearts instead of 1.
I ate their hearts. I thought it would purify my soul. Just for the sake of experimenting. There's one story I haven't told you yet. Back when we still worked at FNaF, Henry and I had this regular client. A priest that had come in with his 2 kids every Friday. Charming guy, always asked for the same toppings. Then he simply stopped coming. Henry thought something must have happened. I told him he probably found him at a restaurant. And then we needed to make something new. About a month later, the priest showed up again. All by himself at sunset. We sat down with him, we talked. He seemed pretty cheerful, more than before. Said his wife had grabbed his kids. He chose to come by himself. He didn't order anything, and he just left. Later that day, Henry and I found out he was killed a week before by his own wife. Checked the security cameras, and sure enough, there was no one there with us at the table. Henry was really distraught. I was fascinated. Now that I look back on it, the priest gave me a smile right before he left. A wide, lifeless smile, hardly human. As if he knew what I was going to do.
Do you remember the names of his kids?
Freddie and Bonnie. I don't remember the priest's name.
William frees the last soul, but not before reaffirming his resolve. When he finally does free the last soul, or perhaps the last 2, he's greeted by the monument to all his sins. Its overwhelming presence is almost enough to stop him, but he prevails. In death, William speaks to his son and the spirit that had held him hostage. Michael and Charlie ask if William has fulfilled his accord, and when he confirms as such, Charlie stays not a second longer than she has to. In William's final moments with Michael, he once again shows just a flicker of remorse. Before he descends to hell, once and for all.
There was never any hope for me, right?
Dead men cannot ever be redeemed. However, I think it'd be the same outcome if you were alive.
Suppose that's how it's always been.
An evil like yours is hard to find, William. It's been interesting. I am grateful for that. May you rot in fiery bits, William Afton.
As I said before, this fan film is legitimately the most high-quality thing I've ever seen come from the FNaF community. Its writing, environments, soundtrack, ambience, and references to other horror media all work together to create what I would safely call a masterpiece. It does a fantastic job of making you feel just as numbed and disoriented as William does throughout the film. The whole time it makes you feel like you're on the edge of understanding, only able to see what's directly in front of you, and even then you're still fighting to comprehend it. Scope.Wad took massive inspiration from some of the greatest modern artists of all time, like H.R. Giger, and hidden gems like Zdzisław Beksinski. His cinematography too was influenced by these artists, as well as the games Scorn and the movies Lighthouse and The Shining, Junji Ito, Tatsuki Fujimoto, Death Note, and the list goes on. But where Scope differs from others here is in the way he uses these references. He doesn't just place these references randomly for cheap points, he uses them to further enrich his artistic expression. He respectfully pays homage and shows reverence for his influences, and places them strategically so that they further the story and your understanding of it. But you didn't notice the funny Shining carpet here, did you? Yeah, boy. My favorite part of this film by far is its soundtrack. It's a mix of songs from different FNaF games and Scorn that all fit and blend so perfectly together that you'd think they were all composed by the same person for the same game. I've deliberately left a lot of stuff out of the summary section, mostly things that I think viewers would get the most joy out of on a first-time watch. If you think you've got the full picture after watching this summary, I promise you don't. If you still, for some reason, haven't watched this piece of absolute kino, I highly advise you do so. So what exactly is the story this film is trying to tell? The story of Family Comes First is actually quite simple, and for the most part follows a more dramatized version of the story told in the Five Nights at Freddy's games. William Afton is called back to the restaurant you had in Pizzeria Simulator, as are all of the animatronics. You can't free all the souls if William Afton still lives, but William Afton can't die unless the souls let go of their hatred for him. Hence the line by Old Man Consequences, "Leave the demon to his demons." Except in this story, William himself is a part of the effort to free the souls. I don't think he does this out of any remorse at all, though I do believe the smallest part of him seeks redemption, and does regret having caused so many years of anguish when he's finally forced to confront it. His main motivation for doing what he does in Family Comes First is his own children, hence the name Family Comes First. All three of his children, save for Michael only by technicality, were killed by his own creations, and all three of his children, including Michael, cannot move on into the afterlife because of William. Even in death, William's ego is still very much intact though, and with that being said, I don't think his lack of guilt for the children he killed is exactly damaged by the end. At the end, the children finally get to rest, and William finally gets to live out the rest of eternity in hell. So what about the parts that aren't so clear? What is Baffelbon, and why does she exist? Baffelbon to me represents William's guilt for the deaths of his own children, as well as the agony he's caused the other children he killed, manifesting into a vengeful spirit. I believe this because when he finally does kill Baffelbon, her body transforms into the original Spring Bonnie suit, and again, she also dies in the same way all three of William's children did. At the same time, Golden Freddy can be seen watching this fight as it's happening, and is only accessible to William after he's put Baffelbon down. It's as if Golden Freddy specifically has manifested all of its rage into one violent being, and the arenas in which it fights William. We know from Ultimate Custom Night that this is likely the case because it's shown in UCN time and time again that Golden Freddy is the most vengeful and unresting of the children's spirits.
I have seen him, the one you shouldn't have killed.
I am remade, but not by you, by the one you should not have killed.
But what about the three heads? This to me represents multiple things. The spirits all watching the one spirit who can't let go of its hatred finally being set free. The agony of all spirits manifests into one nightmarish hydra of gore, or perhaps even a visage of the hell that awaits William. Something I think I should make clear is that Scope is an enjoyer of the FNaF books, and that's certainly evident through the film's themes of agony manifesting into entirely new entities. What about the theater? What you've already assumed from this theater based on what I've given you is probably correct. The theater represents William looking back on the memories with Old Man Consequences, and it's a movie theater specifically because the movie theater itself is an important memory to William. The first time he killed a child, he went to the theater immediately after. This specifically is when he's reminiscing while being trapped in the FNaF 1 location, and I believe this to be true because throughout all of these theater sequences, his pose never changes. His pose, which is extremely similar to the one he's left in after the springlock failure. Even in the games, Old Man Consequences is an enigmatic figure who shows an omnipotent observance of those who meet him. His purpose, being, and presence are all unexplained, but I think he's much more forthcoming than any of us give him credit for. In my eyes, Old Man Consequences plays the same role as Charon in Greek mythology, ferryman of the dead, and the Old Man's Lake is his river Styx. But his price is no mere obol coin. His price varies from person to person. For William, it is to set free the souls he's reaped. To wade into the lake is to be damned. When you sink, you are swallowed into the pits of hell. This interpretation makes his appearance in Ultimate Custom Night even more tragic. When he tells Fredbear to rest his soul, Fredbear instead throws himself into the lake, damning its own soul in order to continue tormenting William. Another thing I love about this film is that it fixes a lot of what I hate about what the character of William Afton has become. In FNaF 3, the revelation that you were fending off the purple guy during the entirety of the game was world-shattering. You were face to face with the antagonist of the entire story. Now he's the guy who says, "I always come back," before getting set on fire for the 16th time, invalidating his previous deaths further and further until in Security Breach, his death means absolutely nothing. And so too does his character. His design has changed in such goofy, insane ways that he's impossible to take seriously in any game after the third, especially with campy-ass voice lines like these.
What a deceptive calling. I knew it was a lie the moment I heard it, obviously, but it is intriguing nonetheless. How can I resist a promise such as this?
But in FCM, he's redesigned in a way that's believable and true to his first design. Scope doesn't give him a voice, allowing you to come up with your own voice for him. Also worth praising is the way Scope sets the tone for the film. The environments... God damn! The environments invoke this claustrophobia that's exacerbated by the 1.85 aspect ratio, reminiscent of the way films were shot in the age of movies like The Shining. Even when you're outside, these alleyways mirror the long, narrow corridors the games have become famous for. The last question I want to pose is just who the hell this other version of Afton is. He appears multiple times throughout the film, and at the end as well, speaking of some sort of deal. But we'll come back to this. Now I'd like to move on to an interview Scope.Wad graciously agreed to. I asked him about a few things I didn't have answers to or was generally curious about. Enjoy. So, how'd you get into Five Nights at Freddy's, and how'd you come to the conclusion you wanted to make Family Comes First? The first Five Nights at Freddy's game released the day before I turned 11, and if I remember correctly, the very first image I saw of it was the render of Chica staring right at you in the restrooms cam on some YouTuber's thumbnail. I got quite obsessed with it, and I still to this day keep up with pretty much everything about it. Eventually, when Pizzeria Simulator released, I was quite annoyed at how there was no explanation for the new designs the animatronics had, and I was genuinely expecting some even more messed up version of Springtrap because of Sister Location's ending. From there, I kind of wanted to make my own headcanon on how to fill those little plot holes, and that's when I started to have ideas about making some stories specifically for Afton. Interesting. So you and I had a similar experience. I was 10 when FNaF 1 released, but for me it was the Living Tombstone song that they made for the first game. And I also had a big issue with the Pizzeria Sim designs. Baby having a giant claw, Springtrap looking like he did. And I also started coming up with my own headcanons for the timeline. Personally, mine ignored the existence of Sister Location and the animatronics from it, and gave Pizzeria Sim's ending to FNaF 3 instead. Which actually leads to another question I had originally planned for later, but what is your headcanon timeline? And on top of that, what is your opinion on the narrative direction FNaF has taken? I actually like to think that Afton's wife, assuming he actually got married and his kids aren't adopted or something, has a lot of importance that we aren't supposed to know about, and that maybe there's some tragic romance story that we only get to see the results of on a grand scale. I think this because of the way he seems to kill/experiment as acts of love in the books. The way Henry seemingly disappears from the story for a while in the games and lets his wound bleed out has always been pretty interesting to me. I don't think there's any hate in his voice when he curses William at the end of Pizzeria Simulator. Even Charlie, the puppet, straight up says, "I don't hate you, but you need to stay out of my way," in UCN. Maybe she thinks William is the one behind the events of the game or something?
I don't hate you, but you need to stay out of my way. I recognize you, but I'm not afraid of you.
I always found it strange how the 30-year gap was used in this story. It was probably so that Scott would have an excuse to get more into the sci-fi stuff, but I don't think he's ever really displayed how it affected the characters at all. In Family Comes First, I wrote it so that William spent those 30 years trapped inside the safe room. However, the games don't quite imply this. They simply mention that Fazbear's Fright opened 30 years after Freddy's closed its doors, which means that William could have easily died about 5 or 10 years before the attraction opened. As for the modern narrative, I think Scott still struggles quite a bit when it comes to working with a team in order to tell a story. Security Breach seems like a series of implications rather than events, and it got even messier when the Burn Trap ending was named the true ending in the files, despite not at all being the ending that gives you 3 stars. I really like the Mimic, his origin, and the way he fits into the story from a very early point in the timeline, but then again, most of these things come from the books, and we've yet to see how Secret of the Mimic will handle things. Interesting. Which one was your favorite, by the way? I think I'm going to go for the usual answer and say the first game. 10 years later, I still find the sound design to be insanely good. The footstep sounds, the carousel music that rarely plays, and even the phone calls. I also really like how it straight up tells you the facts of the story through the newspapers instead of being ambiguous through minigames, and how it leaves it up to you to connect the dots with the actual gameplay. Something that made it stand out a lot from other games is how it makes you get used to the illusion of the animatronics moving around through still renders and some static, only to make you panic when you actually get to see Foxy running down the hallway or Bonnie and Chica twitching and mumbling next to the doors. Yeah, we share that opinion. Personally, I loved the metallic droning that played throughout each night. Those weird, ghostly sounds always set the mood right. Speaking of minigames, I noticed that during Springtrap's Madhouse segment, when he's walking down the stairs to his damnation, the background bore a similar resemblance to those used in the FNaF 3 minigames, specifically Chica's minigame where you give cupcakes to the crying children. Was that on purpose, or fortunate coincidence? Yeah, I tried really hard to use the first 10 minutes of the film just to simply capture that feeling and then throw the viewer into an alley with all the uneasiness that was just displayed, specifically with the giant hole in the wall that returns multiple times, or William hearing that sound in the forest as things begin to blur and the colors fade out. That one was intentional, but it doesn't necessarily have any strong connections with those specific minigames other than the feelings they provoked. I wanted to have the giant crying puppet somewhere in the film too, but couldn't find a place for it to stand out in the way I wanted. I imagine it being displayed in a similar way to some of Beksinski's work, with William encountering it sometime after the audio tapes were used on him. Yeah, I really liked how you took the claustrophobic feel of FNaF and kind of used it psychologically for your viewers. I mean, obviously you have much more wide open spaces in Family Comes First, but For William, he has even less freedom than he did inside the buildings. So when it comes to artistic inspirations, of which include H.R. Geiger's biomechanical style, I felt you put a reverse spin on that style, especially with Balfabon. Everything that should be mechanical in her body isn't. The giant heads of the animatronics, Fredbear's head in the alley specifically, is entirely made of rotted flesh and rancid blood. Would you say that's accurate? Pretty much. Despite getting what he always wanted, he never got the results he expected. He kinda went from being trapped in a room to being trapped in the world itself. I really dig the idea of how things would look like if they were inside out, if that makes sense. Even more so when they seem to be made of flesh. It can give the impression that it could shapeshift, or makes you wonder what the original form really is. Just a bunch of ideas thrown in the mix and seeing what comes out of it. The giant Freddy head was like a mix of the Golden Freddy hallway sighting in FNaF 2, and a lot of bizarre things that happen in Junji Ito's Hanging Balloons story. I originally had this idea where William constantly tries to look at the stars through the clouds multiple times in a melancholic tone throughout the film, and he would notice this one star growing bigger and getting closer each time he checked, and it would be revealed that that star was the giant Freddy head after he picked up the circus baby toy. Then he grew paranoid of the stars. I think there was a lot of Junji Ito's Remina in that idea. Really damn bizarre. If they were inside out, I hate that so much, but I love it. It makes my skin crawl in the best way possible. Pretty cool when it comes to machinery, disgusting when it comes to organisms, and an absolute nightmare when it's biomechanical stuff. I also wanted to ask, have you seen video essays breaking Family Comes First down? I've watched plenty, yeah. It's interesting to see the interpretations of the figure of the Hat Man and the child when everyone leaves William alone in the blank space. The amount of different takes and guesses when it comes to William's true intentions or feelings throughout the story as well. People wondering if he's telling the truth or just lying to himself in certain scenes. Then I assume you've seen that people have affectionately named Balfabon Flesh Trap. What do you think of that? Pretty fitting name, but I'm sure there has to be another OC with that name already. I struggled choosing a name myself until a couple months before I uploaded the animation. In my mind, it needed some demonic touch that would fit with Bonnie, Bon, Bunny, or Rabbit. After a while, I got to Balfabon, which sounds quite similar to Belphegor, so I stuck with that. Apparently, many people call the creature from the In the Flesh story Flesh Trap. That's fair. One thing I saw in one of those essays going over FCM was a critique on the story beat of William having eaten the children's hearts. That if that part were removed from the story wouldn't change. What's your perspective on that? I think it's definitely true, but the same thing goes for the other scenes, I believe. It was there to further emphasize that he really didn't have any limits on himself or even hesitate by the way he seems to explain things to Old Man Consequences, in such a casual way as well. In my mind, it's just as unnecessary as the priest's story. The main purpose in those parts was to kind of show how William perceives or learns from the stuff happening around him, even if he's the cause or not, rather than adding to the plot. I think shoving a corpse inside a suit, knowing the soul could haunt it for all of eternity, is far more morbid than cannibalizing a body, but I suppose it's fair to find one that has real-world cases to be more disgusting. You know, I thought the same thing when I let that critique stew around in my head for a little while. As for the priest's tale, I thought cutting it out of the plot would have been more than detrimental. Yeah, the priest story had more thought put into it. I think it also properly displayed that Old Man Consequences is indeed quite real and that countless others have been there before William. See, I watched the behind-the-scenes video you made where you explained that it served as a sort of cautionary tale to William, and I agreed with that. But going back to Balfabon, I found it kind of interesting that that scene where those metal teeth come out of her gums only happened when it did, not earlier or later. Was there a meaning to showing her teeth popping out? The main reason was just to have a cool body horror sequence, but I think it's also Balfabon putting herself back together after each death. Maybe in a way similar to reincarnation and the way babies grow their teeth. Same thing with the fetus thing coming out of Foxy's chest early in the film. I just thought it looked creepy. I've seen interpretations where she's using the memories of William's kids in order to keep herself alive or something like that, which I thought was really cool. I really like that. And it makes sense considering the nature of each death. A bite by Fredbear, an abduction by Baby, and a scooping by the Scooper. I remember noticing that Baby's faceplates were shaped after a real baby's skull a few years after Suits to Location released. I have no idea what Scott was trying to imply with this or where he was getting at, but I always found it really, really unsettling. Huh. Yeah, maybe that's where the faceplate idea came from in the first place. Could very well be that Baby was the first to be written for Sister Location and the idea spread on to the other cast. Yeah, that might be it. People have been pointing out the similarities the franchise has with Alien for the past few months, but I couldn't find any case of the faceplates being used in any of the Alien movies. Maybe they're talking about Baby's claw and the stomach bursters. There's plenty of stuff that Scott seems to have taken inspirations from, yeah. We had the tongue with the teeth since the first game as well. Body horror in all its iterations has always reigned supreme for me. But earlier, you mentioned the scene with Foxy pulling his chest open to show a fetus. I wanted to ask what the meaning behind the distorted faces was. I myself came up with a few theories. Number one, that they represent the progressive unrecognizability of the decay of a corpse. Number two, that they represent the progressive unrecognizability of the decay of a memory. Or three, that they represent the insides of human beings, or all three. It's pretty much all of those, yeah. I imagine Balfabon sort of using that memory in order to gain a shape, kind of infecting the animatronics from William's point of view, and in the process, kicking him out of his own mind once it was done. Kinda like a parasite into Host. That whole sequence was unironically inspired by this, by the way. Yeah, I remember Scary Caillou. I can only be thankful I never saw it when I was younger. I would have absolutely had nightmares for years. Full-on creepypasta material, but I had really gotten into Faith for a long while. The first act tickled me in a way that was like, oh my god, Midnight Motorist, so I guess that kind of bled into the script for the animation. I wanted to have a separate small story to kind of give an idea that despite Afton's long story with his victim's spirits, in the grand scheme of it just happens to be one of many cases. I actually got to meet Erdorf back in October and he was really, really cool. Got to talk to him about it as well. That is actually really dope. Before we get into the deeper stuff with Family Comes First, I'd like to ask you, do you consider this to be more of a horror film or more of an art piece? Do you feel that you really tried to scare people or make them think more? That's a difficult one. My main objective with the whole thing was to emulate a sort of numb state of mind. The way things sound quite muffled unless they're very close. The constant exaggerated blur and the struggle to see things in the distance. I don't think I really focused that much on scaring people. I know there's like 3 jump scares in the first 25 minutes, but I wanted to make them feel stuck. William himself doesn't have much of a reaction to some of the encounters unless they get physical. Maybe I wanted some people to simply feel disconnected instead of making them think about some philosophical aspect, but if I achieve the latter, then I'm cool with it nonetheless. Not what I would have guessed, but I like it. I wanted to ask you, the scenes where William sits in a movie theater, initially I had thought that they took place when Afton was stuck in the room in FNaF 1, alone with his thoughts, except for the occasional dialogue with Old Man Consequences, and that these scenes were meant to be William looking back at old memories and moments throughout his life as if they were played in front of him. Did I get that right? Pretty much. It's kind of like his life is constantly flashing before his eyes because, well, he's dead but not gone. As for whether or not they take place while he's stuck in the safe room, he's still in the Springtrap suit in those scenes for a reason. Cool. No, that's very interesting. What also interested me was the fact that you chose a movie theater considering Afton's relationship to film. Yeah, it's one of the many memories he feels trapped into. Probably the moment where he thinks he hit the point of no return or something. The wide emptiness of the room also has to do with it. That makes sense. And what about the tombstone at the end? What's the significance of it? Or actually the 3 heads in general? I thought the head on the right might be Bellora's, but I'm not entirely sure, and the head in the middle eludes me entirely. I like to imagine it's some entity that lies in whatever is beneath hell. In my mind, that final shot is showing William being reborn in that place after coming to terms with whatever that thing is or being fully consumed by it. The head on the right was actually meant to be something similar to the version of Circus Baby you see in the 4th Closet comic, a more human version of the animatronic. It's probably something William wanted to achieve at some point with his creations. Anyway, I struggled trying to make the hair, so I just left it like that. It almost reminds me of the first encounter with the Flood in Halo 2, a mass of corpses from across the galaxy who introduces itself as the monument to all your sins. I can definitely see it working similar to the Gravemind in some way. I replayed both Scorn and Security Breach sometime in early 2023, And Security Breach has this one track that sounded really similar in style to Scorn, and I think that's where I realized it could be used for more of the same for the animation. I used different segments of Hunted from Security Breach for the film. I was kind of baffled it's the only track in the whole game that sounds like this. I expected more to sound like it in Ruin, but no. I think that if projects like MyHouse.Wad had released like a year earlier, then I would have likely added some more of that stuff in the film. Really inspiring stuff. Speaking of MyHouse.Wad, was the .wad thing in your name a reference to old Doom mods? Yeah, I think Carmack specified it means where is all the data, which I found pretty funny. Yeah. My name came from Halo 3, Savo Highway. I did a brief search on what it meant, and the real-world location was like, yeah, this is fucking cool. That level felt long as shit the first time I played. I still really like the landscapes in that game, though. I can imagine it did for me as well, but growing up, I didn't have internet, so I'd play the Halo 3 campaign over and over and over again. But I don't think I can remember my first time experiencing any level, oddly enough. I actually didn't get to play the first 3 games until MCC dropped on PC. I grew up with Halo Reach and ODST because my ass wasn't going to pay for Xbox Live. I think I enjoy the grungy vibe of the second game the most. I'll always enjoy Halo 3s the most. I didn't play 2 or CE until much later when I got my own copy of MCC. But anywho, sorry for getting off topic. Halo is my all-time favorite game. But back to the tombstone. I was confused by its imagery. I couldn't think of what the meaning was besides the simple fact that the children are finally at rest, but the stain of agony is still there. I'm not really sure how to word this question, but to put it plainly, the tombstone confuses me. I think it was meant to be more of a pod or an egg, something that is beginning to make its roots by using Afton as a host, almost. If you look closely, you'll notice he's in the same pose as he was in the first shot of the film. Interesting. But that final shot is mostly there as a nice little bow to properly wrap up the film, just to make the viewer leave with one last, what the fuck is that? So, I'm a writer myself, and my entire creative process is filled by music. I listen to a song, and an idea comes, and then it turns into a vivid vision. What is your creative process like? Might sound corny as hell, but I think sometimes I'm simply impulsed by hate. I disliked the sudden character designs in Pizzeria Simulator, I disliked the narrative nosedive in Security Breach, I disliked the amount of loose ends that were simply used as devices rather than getting wrapped up onto something interesting. I've seen some people call this film anti-FNaF in a complimentary way, and I can kinda see it. Even though I don't fully understand what they really mean with that, I suppose it has something to do with the whole just let it end vibe. I also listened to a lot of music and read some stuff while working on it, and it's likely that some of the lyrics from the first 2 Slipknot albums had some influence on it. Their song Purity is about a girl trapped in a box, for example. There's also the Look Back manga that I read soon after they announced the movie adaptation, which has to do with the protagonist thinking about what would happen if they could go back and change things. I think the fun part of the process was basically mixing other stuff I love with FNaF's concepts, while still trying to make it feel integrated in a way that doesn't feel forced. See, for me, I catalog a lot of themes or tropes or filming techniques, etc., into one big blender where they eventually come out as something new in the form of whatever I create. None of which appears on my YouTube channel, but, you know. For my own curiosity, though, who was the other Afton that appears throughout the film? The one that always shows up in that still brand new spring Bonnie suit. And what's the deal he talks to himself about when Afton goes to hell? The suit actively coming after him was one of the first fundamental ideas I had, if I remember correctly. The scene at the end of the stairs, when there's nobody left to judge but himself, is to show how he spends his last moments trying to justify his ego once more rather than giving one last thought as to what he did to his family or victims. I think in a metaphorical way, it settles how he was never the hero of his own story either. The deal thing is to leave a spooky balance between religious undertones and how he sacrifices his humanity to the Spring Bonnie suit in order to get eternal life. Kind of a parallel to how someone would make a deal with the devil. Well, I'd sincerely like to thank you for taking part in this interview, and for responding when I reached out. This video won't be out for a long while, but I'd also like to ask you if there are any future projects you'd like to tease. Right now, I'm planning to spend the rest of the year learning to code in Godot and see if I can make a small fan game in the style of Dusk or Quake, similar to Fazbear Armageddon, but without the Ultra Kill voice. Very nice. I took 2 coding classes in high school and quickly realized it was my least favorite thing I've ever done. Yeah, I'm kinda hating it as well. Thank you so much for watching, and thank you, Scope.Wad, once again for not only making such a wonderful film, but for agreeing to this interview. This video has been about 9 months in the making, and I've spent the last 2 or 3 weeks plugging away at it as I wasn't able to work on it while I was away at uni. If you're new to the channel, I have plenty more video essays as well as many gaming videos with more of both coming in the future. I'll strongly advise once more that you go and watch Family Comes First for yourself. It's free to watch, and I've purposefully left multiple pieces of it uncovered for you to enjoy. Take care.